Thanks very much, everyone, for coming. I really hope that you can see everything on the screen today. There may be some points when I have to actually read what's written there, so bear with me. Some of my text is a little light, but hopefully my thoughts are not. I'm going to talk today actually about a project that I've been working on for about 10 years. This project began for me right after I'd closed my game company in 2002. I'd worked for a number of years doing commercial games for companies like Sony and Microsoft, and I'd started my own company, and in the sort of the kind of lingering shock of 9/11, and really combined with my own sense that I needed to really rethink what I was doing, I went on a 10,000-mile road trip around the country, visiting spots that spots of Americana that really intrigued me for various reasons. But I was rereading Walden as I drove around the country. And I have family in the Boston and surrounding areas. So I made a special trip to make sure that I went to the pond on this kind of sojourn, this sort of personal journey. I'd been there many, many times, actually, as a child. Like I mentioned, I have much, family in the area. And we were always sort of there on family vacations, and my father always made sure that we would read a book by a famous author every time we went on vacation. He had to read a book by whoever lived wherever we went. So I'd been there many times, but this day was different. This day it had rained in the morning, and the pond, which is usually just filled with people out walking and spending time in the water and fishing, was really strangely quiet and empty. And so I had it basically to myself, which is kind of an odd situation these days. And I spent quite some time there walking along in the woods. And as I was leaving, I stopped by the replica of Thoreau's house. It's actually not at the site. It's in the parking lot. For those of you who haven't been there, you know what I mean. It's set away from the actual woods. So Thoreau's house is sitting there in this sort of damp, quiet morning, and the door is cracked open, and I can see through the door a silhouette of the author sitting by the fireside reading a book. And I think, oh, they've got like a replica, a dummy, right? So without asking permission or knocking or anything, I just walked right in. And the dummy shuts his book, and he looks at me and he says, "Greetings, traveler. Where do you hail from?" Right? And we proceeded to have a really nice conversation. The dummy, who I later learned is Richard Smith, a historian who enacts Thoreau in a kind of living museum style, stayed in character, and we had this lovely discussion about sort of Thoreau's experiment and what he intended by it and what he how he set it out. And it was really a wonderful experience for me. And that night I wrote in my journal, I think I'd really like to make a game about Walden, but I have no idea how to do it. And I closed that chapter and I went on, and I actually changed my career path at that point. And I went from the commercial game industry into academia, where I helped form the USC Games program, one of the earliest programs where we teach game design and games as culture. And I helped form that program, and I helped form something called the Game Innovation Lab that's a research center there. And there we tackle very hard problems in game design. So over the course of the next 5 years, I had the opportunity to work on some really difficult and intriguing problems in game design. A couple of the games that we produced at my lab are games like these. The one on the left is called Cloud, and you play a boy in a hospital who dreams he can fly up in the sky and make friends with the clouds. There are no enemies in the game, there's no conflict in the game. It's a very new sort of genre of play, and it was a very difficult design problem to solve. The game went on to be very popular online, And it really sort of set the stage for a number of other projects that followed. One of which was a project I made with an artist named Bill Viola. I don't know if you are familiar with Bill's work, but it's usually deeply spiritual in nature. It's very, very beautiful, serene. He looks very closely at things to find sort of a kind of a truth by looking at the surface so deeply that you sort of see what's beyond it. This is a screenshot from that game. And working with an artist, a sort of major artist like Bill, taught me something about my own work. It taught me that even when things are really confusing and they seem really blurry, that if you keep your eye on what you find intriguing about a particular question or problem or idea, that you don't need to have all the answers right away, that you can work through the answers and you can trust in your process and you can trust in the team that you're working with, and that eventually somehow you will find an interesting solution if you've asked a difficult and interesting question. So after the work on the Night Journey was complete in about 2007, I found that I had grown as a game designer, and I revisited that idea that I had written in my journal 5 years before. And I decided that even if I didn't know the answer of how to make this game about Thoreau's stay at Walden, that I might as well try, that I had the right place and the right team and the right environment to try. And so I bought a stack of copies of Walden, and I brought them to all of the people who work in my lab, and I gave everyone a copy, and had everyone read it and take notes. And that was the start of our journey to develop the game that I'm going to talk about today. So with that, let's talk about Thoreau himself. Everyone knows him. But, the thing about Thoreau is until he started keeping a journal in 1837, there wasn't anything much remarkable about Henry David Thoreau. He was born in 1817 in Concord, Mass., where he would spend most of his life. His family made pencils. They had a pencil factory, which, given his eventual career as a writer, seems somewhat appropriate. He actually invented a better pencil and has a patent on it. He attended Harvard and was a good but not a brilliant student. And after graduating, he returned home and he got a job as a teacher, which he promptly quit because he refused to beat the students. At that point, he embarked on a career of walking and thinking and getting to know the area of Concord better than anyone has ever likely done before, possibly since. And supported by a series of odd jobs, such as building fences and surveying land, he was probably best known to his neighbors as that fool who burned down the woods because of an unfortunate camping incident he had had. So in 1837, shortly after befriending Ralph Waldo Emerson, he began keeping a journal, apparently at Emerson's provocation. And this lifelong work included all of his observations about Concord, his environment and the details, the wildlife, the terrain, the ponds, the people and the animals of the area. And these observations would form the basis of his published writings, and they would also provide the basis for scores of scholars and scientists and philosophers and artists and otherwise who have used Thoreau's work for their own inspiration and their own creative endeavors. So, for example, just recently, within the past few years, the NSF funded a study using Thoreau's notes on blooming dates of local plants to compare to current blooming dates to understand the effects of global warming in the area, right? So his detailed notes were so precise that they're useful to us today. They're useful to scientists today. So Emerson and Thoreau, as we know, were famously great friends, and they were part of a larger circle of intellectuals in Concord. Emerson's house sat at the outskirts of the town, which in hindsight, of course, seems home to a statistically improbable number of great writers. His house was at what might be seen as the liminal point, the liminal edge of society before you enter the woods that Thoreau would wander in for hours every day. He walked for 4 hours a day, he says. And while Concord was certainly a town and not a city, it was civilization enough for Thoreau to wish to escape it. And so in 1845, Emerson allowed him to build a cabin on his woodlot, a piece of land on the north shore of Walden Pond, to conduct what Thoreau called an experiment in living. There were actually a lot of such experiments going on at the time, mostly social groups. And Thoreau didn't have much interest in the group experiments. But conversely, no one else had much interest in Thoreau's experiment at that time. He was just a guy, who was out there living in the woods, on a woodlot, not far from town. But so, really, for the most part, Henry was free to live as simply as he liked, to come and go from town to the solitude of the woods, with Emerson's house there at that dividing point as a way station and a lending library all in one. One of the things that's always struck me about the book is that it's a mix of both the quantitative, his sort of precise notes and details, and the qualitative, his just rich, expressive descriptions of the outcomes of the experiment that he made. It's a very loose narrative, and it barely has a narrative, but it's a very loose narrative. Sets out the goals and the structure of his experiment, which were to live as simply as he could, to determine what he felt were the essentials of life. And then after that, it goes on describing in detail his findings, how much it cost him to live, how much work he did during each season, about his needs for survival and for society or not, for those things that he required beyond mere survival. Thoreau describes only the first year of the experiment in detail, beginning in the summer when he built his cabin, leading into fall and winter, and finally into spring. The basics of his life are the focus of the work, how he spent each day, exactly how he built his home, how many nails are in it, how he fed himself, all of the visitors and the specifics of the pond. So, the interesting thing, we probably all know this, is that mundane tasks, when you're washing your dishes or, mowing the lawn, tend to allow your mind to wander and think of, make interesting connections. And Thoreau was no different. So while he was planting his bean field, he pondered on how many of his fellow farmers became bogged down in planting larger and larger fields just to make money, to build larger houses that needed more money to upkeep them. He finds, he says, that men are so occupied with the factitious cares and superfluously coarse labors of life that its finer fruits cannot be plucked by them. Thoreau went to the woods, as he says, to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life. And we know that part of the quote, everyone knows that. But then he goes on to more clearly define his goal as reducing life to its lowest terms, and if it proved to be mean, to get the whole and genuine meanness of it, and publish its meanness to the world. Or, if it were sublime, to know it by experience, and to be able to give a true account of it. So, I suspect we all know on which side of this equation Thoreau fell, but when we made the game and we allowed players to play their own way through this experiment, we wanted them to be able to choose. We wanted there to be a real question about how they would come out of this experiment. So, the way game designers work, the way that I work, we generally start by modeling, and we often model on paper. These are some pictures of the early models that we would make to describe to ourselves how the underlying systems of the game would work. So later on, these models and mechanics will be wrapped in animations and sounds and, a sort of beautiful environment for the player to experience, of course. That's what we all see when we see games. But figuring out what this underlying system was, I think, was one of the things that drew me to working on this project in the first place. Thoreau's writing, because he was an amateur naturalist as well as a poet and philosopher, described the systems of his world in detail. He would merge the scientific and the sublime, and the personal and the universal, and the natural and the aesthetic. And his book is really that rare text that stands as fully in the arts and humanities as it does in the sciences. So to me, just as an aside, it's proof that the way that we've divided these domains in our own thinking and teaching about them is really arbitrary and somewhat unhelpful to learning about the way that they cross over. So in order to build out this system and the system of this game, our team needed to understand Thoreau's ideas about the system of his experiment. In the very first chapter of the book, he specifies 4 basic needs that he says are the necessaries of life. These are food, fuel, shelter, and clothing. And only when we have obtained these things, he says, are we able to adventure on life. And beyond these necessities and interwoven in finding them for himself are the rest of the book, including inspiration found while reading and solitude, in listening to the sounds of the environment, and his visitors that are natural and otherwise. What you're seeing here, by the way, are the team moves from paper prototypes to very rough digital prototypes that have no art or animation in them, just trying to figure out how the simulation, the underlying rules of the simulation work. So these are this is sort of the rough sketches of game design. I'm just sort of showing you a little bit behind the curtains. So what it really came down to in the end was Thoreau's system comes down to a tension between sustaining life and seeking inspiration, or what he calls sublime. And so, as we've all experienced in our own lives, that tension almost always comes down to a couple of tough issues. How much time we spend taking care of our basic needs versus how we choose to spend our leisure time, what we have of it. Thoreau felt pretty strongly that the simpler we could make our lives, the more instinctively we would tend toward the sublime and away from the kind of the grind of everyday life. So in designing our system, it was important to us that we allowed players a variation and a real choice to either move more towards the grind or more towards the sublime. So this is the screen where it might be hard to see stuff, and there's nothing there now, so don't worry. But I'm going to explain. So the kind of key relationship in Thoreau's system was between what he calls the vital heat and the effort that we humans need to put into maintaining that. So you can't really see, but it says food, fuel, shelter, and clothing right here. And we need to put effort into maintaining that food, fuel, shelter, and clothing in order to maintain that vital heat, right? If we let those 4 things, food, fuel, shelter, and clothing, sort of fall, if we sort of let ourselves go in our own lives go into disrepair, then they will be a drain on our vital heat, right? And they will cause us to essentially, not be able to maintain ourselves. So in our game, we allow time to restore energy, but time also is a drain on things like food and fuel. Obviously, you use them over time. What we're really after, though, is that sublime inspiration, which Thoreau finds through attention to things like reading and sounds of the woods, solitude, and visitors. And it's difficult to see, but it says attention to those 4 things there. That's the invisible text. And of course, time weighs on these things as well, sort of wearing away. Even when you have a moment when, one of those inspiring moments when everything seems to click together and it just stops. but time wears that away. You can't keep that moment forever. So we need to keep attending to those things that inspire us as well. We might be lured to take jobs, you can see over here, which would help us to more efficiently buy things like food and fuel and shelter and clothing, and thereby we think, oh, we're going to have more time, right? But that money actually proves to be a lure. There's a trap there, because it also causes us to think, well, I could spend it to upgrade my stove or my fishing pole or whatever it is that, I could get a better axe, and then I'm going to be able to be more efficient. So that money is really a lure. In our game, you can do things like you can explore the forest by running and rowing and walking. And what you find when you explore the woods are different kinds of wildlife. You find resources that can help you to just live a simple life in the woods, and what we call arrowheads. So these arrowheads are they're kind of a metaphor. Thoreau is famously great at finding Indian relics. He would just find them in the forest when he was digging his cellar or walking along. And we've used those as a metaphor. So when you are inspired, the forest will glitter with these little arrowhead relics. And when you pick them up, you will be rewarded with a moment from the book, a special moment like the War of the Ants, which is a moment that everyone tends to remember from the book, or other memorable highlights from the book. And those are all collected in your journal, which is your own personal procedural version of Walden. And so everyone's journey will be different, but in the end of your journey, you will have this procedural version of all of the special moments that you have found in the woods. There's one other thing, and that is inspiration, when it's high, will also feed back into energy. And this is important because I know we've all experienced it when you feel really inspired and you're really engaged and interested, suddenly you have a ton of energy, right? And what that does is this helps this from being a grinding game. It helps you to then accomplish your basic task much easier. So there's no winning and losing in this particular game, because really this is more about experiencing Thoreau's experiment. Each player may judge their outcome by their own standards. The environment of the game, though, does provide feedback about the way that you're living, and we hope it will influence your sensibility about that experience in much the same way that Thoreau's description of Walden form a kind of objective correlative regarding his own experiment. Our game will become richer and more filled with potential as you live a life in balance, and less rich and kind of more mundane as you live the life of Thoreau's fellow townsmen, whose misfortune, he said, it was to have inherited farms, houses, barns, cattle, and farming tools, because these things are more easily acquired than got rid of. So, for example, the world will, you probably can't see it on this projector, but the world will literally fade and become less lustrous if you spend too much time involved in daily tasks. And conversely, if you're able to balance your basic needs and your more ephemeral needs, the world will become more lush and filled with more potential discoveries that build your relationship with this sort of virtual nature. It's an interesting problem as a game designer to use the world itself as a meter, because it requires players to use a kind of visual acuity that's rarely developed. But I do think that people have a kind of innate instinct about it. So when we've play tested it so far, players will tell us they start to feel they feel like things are getting negative. They're not certain why, but things are changing around them and they feel sort of negative about the world. And they only realize a little bit later what's happening, that they're losing this inspiration. And conversely, when things start to get more lush and more rich, all of a sudden they'll say, oh my God, things are really changing here. So to support this use of the world as a visual meter, we've set the game in a kind of it's a very lush, romantic, what I would call romantic realism, so that the extremes will be more noticeable. And this felt fitting as well for the tone of the piece, because we all know that Thoreau did his adventuring on life just a couple miles from his own town. He wasn't really roughing it. He wasn't like, going out there and striking it out on his own. He took his, mending home to his mother, which you can do in the game as well. Everyone asks, so we had to put it in, right? But yeah, we knew from the beginning that we wanted this kind of lush 3D world. We looked also at autochrome photography as a possible reference point, but in the end, it has this kind of more painterly, romantic style that we think will make it really work. Additionally, we wanted all of the trees and the plants and the animals that make up our world to reflect Thoreau's own observations. So what we did is I have a lot of grad students, so we coded the book. We went through the book and we coded for every mention of different plants and animals. And basically, the choices that we made, because we certainly couldn't model every plant and animal in the Walden area, the choices that were made were based on what Thoreau talks about. So this is an expression of Thoreau's Walden, not necessarily of a ecologically correct Walden. It is very much a translation of his work. So these are just actually some of the databases that we use to code the work, and then we moved on once we made choices to these are model sheets for creating all of the animals that are the plants and the animals that are in the work. Also, it made sense to use Thoreau's own surveying work to build our 3D terrain. He himself, as I mentioned, was a surveyor, and so we have this lovely map that he made of the pond in his own time. Of course, it's not as accurate as we would like, so we combine that with U.S. geographical data of today, and with some massaging, it's very accurate. People who are very familiar with the pond, who walk it, get a sense of almost deja vu. The green marked area here is actually the playable area of the game, so it's actually quite large. You can explore all of the sides of the pond. You're bounded by the road to Concord on one side and the railroad on the other. There's a kind of natural break here around Emerson's Cliff in the south and along these pasture lines in the north. But it's a very large playable area, and Emerson's home is at that top corner there. Like I mentioned, it's sort of that liminal point between the woods and society. There's also, you can go to a section of Concord if you need to buy food or fuel, if you need to visit the post office. Thoreau thought it was sort of running the gauntlet to go to town, so that area of the game is quite busy and has a much kind of more urban, if you will, it's a town, but it has an urban feel to it, whereas the woods are quite serene. It's possible, actually, to survive the entire game without ever going into Concord. You can forage for food, you can find your own fuel, you can mend your own clothes, you can repair your own shelter, and if you play well, you can actually live a completely self-reliant life in the woods. But there are seasons in the game, and so this is actually showing what plants are edible for the player during certain months. The game starts where it says 4 SU right here on the bottom, and you can see there's a lot of plants that are edible at that time of year. So it's kind of bountiful when you start the game. And it's all very sort of conducive to feeling like your experiment is going to be successful. But then as the fall wears and then finally the winter, we get into winter, there are very few plants that can be foraged during the winter. Really only the groundnut and the sumac are available during the winter months. So it becomes really difficult unless you know where to find these plants to survive. So many players wind up having to rely on the town, and you see how difficult this part of the experiment is. Of course, the more time that you spend foraging for food and doing these basic tasks, the less time that you will have for the sublime. I'm starting to describe an experiment with just about feeding yourself, right? Which that doesn't sound very conducive to the sublime. So therein lies the problem that Thoreau sets for us. How do you choose wisely and simplify strategically so that you will have time both to keep yourself, to maintain yourself in the world, but also to search for that sublime? In the early game, we expect, like Thoreau actually, in most of the summer months, he spent a majority of his time just working, and that's what we expect players to do. So they will spend most of their time satisfying their basic needs, building their shelter and foraging for food. Very little time seeking out the sort of inspirational areas of the forest. We've abstracted the tasks of survival to those directly related to Thoreau's necessaries of life. So each of these tasks has a kind of tech tree, if you will. It's there's very little tech here, mostly trees, but as an example, a player that's starting out learns that they can eat freely from the fruits of the forest. It takes very little effort, but it takes a lot of time because you have to keep picking more and more berries. And then you figure out, for example, that you could get a fishing pole, and you might be able to catch fish, which would sustain you longer. But of course, you have to have that tool, and you also have to, fishing is luck, right? Sometimes you never catch a fish, right? So you never know. Or you could maybe plant beans. And again, there's a lot of work, and you have to caretake them. It takes some time for it to grow. But then you will have a crop of beans at the end. So it's an investment of time. So the interesting thing here is that we're not trying to get you to necessarily make, buy into any of these things. Certainly, even though we offer food for purchase and fuel for purchase, and you can even go and buy a suit of fancy clothes, we're not saying that that's what you should do. However, a lot of game players, because these things are available, and just like in life, you covet these things that are available in the store, see them, and they say, oh, well, I've got to buy a suit of fancy clothes, right? Even though, Thoreau warns us about these things. But so these things are there as a lure. There's this idea that you should want to get some efficiency so that you don't have to spend all of your time maintaining your basic needs, but then don't be lured into the trap that we all fall into, which is where we start by just trying to sustain ourselves, and then we start by trying to buy luxuries and upgrade and get more and more and more and more, right? So the idea is not to fall into that trap. You can, if you like, become something of a bean farmer, and you can make actually a lot of money being a bean farmer in Walden, but you will spend a lot of time working on your bean farm and going to town and selling those beans and not attending to your ephemeral needs. Thoreau actually learned that it was very tempting to overplant, he says, in his first year. He saw how easy it was to become like the young man that he saw creeping down the road of life, pushing a barn 75 feet by 40. So in the game, you can also, by the way, be lured into the path of the Walden millionaire. You can buy those fancy clothes, and when you have those fancy clothes, you might be invited to go give a lecture or submit an article, and suddenly you're down the path of being a famous author. But as you do these things, as you spend this time traveling and giving your talks and all this stuff, you are not attending to your ephemeral needs. So what happens is your relationship to the nature of the game grows dim, as I was saying, and then that forest, when you go to revisit it, doesn't have those artifacts, those arrowheads, those glimmering moments of epiphany that the book is filled with, and so your journal will remain empty. Your journal will remain poverty-stricken. So we don't just want you to do that. We don't want you to just grind and be a bean farmer, right? So we have these lures, these sort of beautiful lures that we've put into the game to draw you away from the mundane tasks into listening to the sounds of the forest. This is a map of where you might hear the sounds of the train, the sounds of the church bells, the sounds of the people walking along the road, all of the sounds that he describes from this sort of beautiful distance. That he liked his society best on his horizon. He did not like to be in it, but he liked to see it through almost like a haze. And he liked to hear it through that kind of charming distance. And so this map shows you where, if you're walking the woods, you'll tend to hear those sort of sounds of the distant society, and that will bring you inspiration. Because you might have trouble finding all of the various places, the special inspirational places on the map, we have, and you can barely see it, but there's little lines here. These are animal paths, and as you walk the forest, animals will appear in your sort of in your path, and if you follow them, they'll lead you past interesting points. There are things like reading rocks, where texts, Thoreau envisioned a library in the midst of a wilderness, he said. And in our game, there is a library of the texts that he was inspired by that you can find sitting on what we call reading rocks throughout the forest. And there are places where solitude feels the strongest and such. Things like this, again, they'll add to your inspiration. They'll increase your relationship to this nature. But so these things might be hard to find, but luckily the game is very quietly paced, and it gives us time to sort of mull over these things and find our way towards a kind of balance. Later in the game, we expect that a player who's listening to sort of the cues that we've put there will balance out their time so that they will have a sort of equal amount of time attending to their basic needs, attending to these sort of beautiful moments, and then, of course, moving around between them. So I am going to play some of the game here for you. We're going to hope that the sound works, and if not, we have a backup. We're in luck. Look at that. Okay, so I should mention that we've just brought in a sound designer who's creating a procedural soundscape. That means that the sound will change. He actually lives in Concord, and he's recording the animals over the course of a year. And so the sound will change over the course of a year, over the course of a day, over the course of a season. Thoreau actually moved into his unfinished home, which is what you do in the game, at the pond on Independence Day in 1845. And he spent a good deal of his time that summer finishing work on the cabin, as well as planting his bean field. My house, he wrote, was on the side of a hill, immediately on the edge of a larger wood, in the midst of a young forest of pitch pines and hickories, and half a dozen rods from the pond, to which a narrow footpath led down the hill. As I walk along the stony shores of the pond in my shirt sleeves, though it is cool as well as cloudy and windy, and I see nothing special to attract me, all the elements are unusually congenial to me. In the winter, he says, I met no one on my walks, but frequently tramped 8 or 10 miles through the deepest snow to keep an appointment with a beech tree or a yellow birch or an old acquaintance among the pines. Thoreau called himself the self-appointed inspector of snowstorms and rainstorms. In any weather and any hour of the day or night, I have been anxious to improve the nick of time, he says, and notch it on my stick too, to stand on the meeting of two eternities, the past and the future, which is precisely the present moment, to toe that line. In the spring, our prospects brighten on the influx of better thoughts. A single gentle rain makes the grass many shades greener. I am convinced, he said, by both faith and experience, that to maintain oneself on this earth is not a hardship, but a pastime, if we will this simply and wisely. Thoreau lived at the pond for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days before becoming a sojourner in civilized life again. In our game, a player may continue their stay at Walden for as long as they like. The game itself ends after a year, and then they can wander the woods until they are ready to advance confidently in the direction of their own dreams. So I can't end this talk without giving credit to the team of students and faculty and staff at USC who've given so much time to this. This is quite, frankly, until we received the small grant we just got from the NEA, it's been a labor of love, mostly volunteers. I tend to produce this by what I call the Tom Sawyer method of production, which is to convince everyone that it's really cool to paint that fence, and they've done it wonderfully. So thank you.
Okay, we have just enough time to have a couple of questions for Tracy. So please put your hand in the air if you're interested in asking a question. Yes, yes. All right. You, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Mary. My question is, how much of the actual text from Walden is in the video game that the player would experience? Thank you.
Actually, quite a bit. So if you saw during the video, when they would click on a plant, it comes up with a quote about it. So all of the plants and animals in the world have quotes. Mostly they're actually contextual to the season. So he talked about them in different seasons. So there's all quotes from him about the environment. Also, as I mentioned, the arrowhead moments are all depictions from the text. And there will also be voiceover that it's not going to be necessarily discovered in the order of the book, but it will be played to contextualize the experience. So it's not going to be a reading, for example. It won't be the entire text, and it won't be necessarily in the same order. But you know, the wonderful thing about Thoreau in making a game like this is he's so quotable. Right? He has these wonderful little pithy statements that he makes, and they all go so well together. It doesn't necessarily need to be in the order of the book. But so there will be actually quite a bit of the text in the book, in the game.
Okay, we have a question over here.
All right, from our budding game designer.
I'm Chester Carlson. I have a question. How would your game control?
Right, okay, so it uses the keyboard and the mouse, and I don't know if you've played a first-person game where you use WASD. So you put your fingers on WASD, for those of you who haven't, and that controls you forward and backwards and left and right. And then the mouse allows your head to look around, right? And then there are some special controls for running and jumping. You also have a lantern that you can use at night, and you can bring up your journal, which has a compass and a map in it to tell you where you are in the world. But it's very simple, and it's very if you've played any first-person game, you could play it.
Okay, we have a question over here.
Hi, my name is Kathy. My question is, who do you anticipate your audience of gamers will be?
So that's a great question. Well, I think the first audience is people who are interested in experimental games and indie games. There's an up-and-coming community of people who are interested in seeing games go beyond the standard fare. And so I think that's the first audience, right? But I really hope, and one of the reasons actually Chester's question is so good, is that we tried to stick with very simple controls and a very simple interface. You notice there's not a lot of doodads on the interface to get in the middle of your experience. We did that because we hope to attract people who wouldn't necessarily play a typical computer game. We don't want people to feel at all like they have too much information to be paying attention to. We want them to be able to get right into the experience in a very simple and emotional way.
Okay, I think we have time for one more really quick question. Oh, that answered his question. Okay.
Okay,
I
somebody
see a
else.
question back here. Okay.
You can.
This is very thought-provoking. I feel like I have a lot of questions, so I'll just ask one.
Just one, please.
What aspects of life do you think are not able to be captured in a video game? Aspects of history, literature. Do you think it's all potentially captured in a game, or that's not necessary?
Well, first of all, I would have to say that media cannot replace direct experience, right? So, some of just the very tactile, the sensory, these things are impossible, at least right now, to capture in a video game. And the richness and the depth of just some of the things we experience in everyday life, right? But each medium, each different kind, has its own special, unique things that it does best. And so what a game does best is help us to understand how things work, right? And that's why I thought this would actually make a good game, because Thoreau was trying to figure out, at a very essential level, how the choices we make change our relationship to nature and the sublime, right? He was trying to figure out how that system worked. And so that's why I thought this particular text would make a good video game. I don't think every single text makes a great video game, just like I don't think it makes a great movie, or vice versa, for example. But hey, maybe I'm just not imaginative enough to think of how some of these other texts might be made. Someone comes after me and they might actually figure it out. So I wouldn't say it never could happen.
Okay, thank you so much.